"Please, don't lift my dress," his maid begged. But the millionaire did, and couldn't forget what he saw. The rain had been falling for hours, the kind of steady drizzle that muted the world into a gray hush. At the edge of town, the Whitmore estate loomed like a stone sentinel, its windows glowing faintly against the storm. Inside, the marble floors gleamed under soft light, but to the young woman moving quietly through its halls, it felt less like a home and more like a stage where she was never meant to be seen. Her name was Clara Hayes, 22, a maid for barely a month. Yet she already knew every creak in the floorboards and every shadow cast by the ornate chandeliers. She kept her head down, her voice soft and her footsteps lighter than the rain tapping against the tall windows. For Clara, invisibility wasn't just part of the job, it was survival. The master of the house, Daniel Whitmore, was a man of formidable presence. At 35, his reputation as a brilliant calculating businessman was matched only by the rumors of his cold demeanor. People said his eyes, icy and unflinching, could strip a person down to their truth. Most staff avoided even the possibility of crossing paths with him. Clara was no different, or so she told herself. That night, while the storm whispered against the walls, Daniel returned earlier than usual from a business trip. He moved through the house like a shadow, taking in the subtle changes only a man who demanded perfection would notice. And then he saw her. Down the grand hallway in front of a window veiled with rain, Clara was dusting a small glass vase. Her posture was deliberate, almost rehearsed, as if she had calculated the exact distance between herself and the nearest exit. Daniel paused mid-step. Something about her stillness and her avoidance of his gaze stirred an unexpected curiosity. She didn't stammer or fumble like others when they realized he was watching. Instead, she seemed intent on pretending he wasn't there at all. It wasn't arrogance. It was evasion, the kind that came from fear. He found himself wondering what she was hiding, and more importantly, why. If this had been anyone else, Daniel would have let the thought slip away, buried under the endless to-do lists that ruled his life. But something about Clara, her silence, her restraint, stayed with him. Long after she disappeared down the corridor, he was still thinking about the way her eyes had darted not to him, but to the door. And that was the moment he knew. Whatever secret she carried, it wouldn't stay hidden forever. The next morning broke clear, the rain swept away by a crisp autumn wind. The Whitmore estate, with its sprawling gardens and towering columns, stood under a pale blue sky. Inside, Clara moved through her chores like clockwork, polishing the silver in the dining room, straightening books in the library, and checking for streaks on the tall windows that framed the front lawn. She worked with the same deliberate care as always, but Daniel Whitmore had begun to notice things others didn't. He saw the way her eyes rarely lingered on anyone's face for more than a second. He saw her pause, just for a heartbeat, before entering any room, as though calculating who might be inside and whether she should turn back. It wasn't shyness. Daniel knew shy people. This was something sharper, more controlled, as if every movement was part of a strategy to remain unseen. And yet, she wasn't clumsy or withdrawn in her work. If anything, her precision impressed him. Later that afternoon, Daniel stood on the mezzanine balcony that overlooked the grand foyer. From above, he spotted her adjusting a massive floral arrangement near the front doors. The vase was nearly as tall as her waist, filled with fresh lilies and roses. Clara's movements were graceful, but her eyes, they kept flickering toward the entrance the way someone might check an escape route. Daniel leaned on the railing, studying her. The sound of the gardener's shears clicking outside blended with the faint ticking of the foyer clock. It was then he realized he was holding his breath. Why did it matter? She was just a maid, a temporary hire at that. But something about her detachment gnawed at him. He descended the stairs slowly, his polished shoes echoing off the marble. By the time he reached the bottom, she had already slipped through a side door toward the east wing. He considered calling after her, but decided against it. For now. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself noting her routines, where she was at certain times, how she seemed to vanish into less used corridors, how she avoided conversation with anyone who asked too many questions. It wasn't obsession, he told himself. It was curiosity. But curiosity was dangerous for a man like him. It led to involvement, and involvement often came with complications he didn't need. Still, as Daniel stood in his office that evening, looking out over the manicured lawn, he couldn't shake the image of Clara's wary eyes. He had built his life on reading people, clients, competitors, partners, and he could usually spot a lie within seconds. Clara wasn't lying. She was hiding. And Daniel Whitmore didn't like puzzles he couldn't solve. It was well past 9 o'clock when most of the staff had already gone home, leaving the Whitmore estate draped in a hushed stillness. The golden sconces along the hallways cast soft pools of light on the marble floors, and somewhere deep in the house, the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Clara Hayes was in the guest washroom, an immaculate space of white marble streaked with subtle gray, veining gold fixtures gleaming under a crystal chandelier. She knelt in front of the full-length mirror, a soft cloth in her hand, carefully polishing the lower edges. Her hum was barely audible, a gentle tune that didn't seem to belong to this cold, opulent world. She didn't hear the footsteps at first. Daniel Whitmore had decided to take a walk through the East Wing, something he rarely did at night. The muffled melody caught his attention, drawing him toward the partially open door. He pushed it open without a sound, stepping inside. His presence filled the space instantly. Clara startled, jerking upright so quickly she almost dropped the cloth. "Sir, I'm almost finished," she said. Her voice rushed, her grip tightening around the fabric. She made to pass him, but the narrow gap between the sink and counter forced her to brush too close. In her haste, the hem of her dress caught on the sharp corner of the marble counter. She froze her hand, darting down to press the fabric against her legs. The tiniest lift in the material made her eyes widen in alarm. "Wait," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. Her breathing quickened. "Please, don't lift my dress," she whispered, and there was no mistaking the tremor in her tone. It wasn't embarrassment. It was fear. Real, raw fear. Daniel's brow furrowed. He wasn't used to hearing that note in anyone's voice, much less from someone in his own home. For a moment, he thought about stepping back, letting her pass. But something, instinct perhaps, kept him still. Slowly he reached down his fingers, brushing against hers, as he moved her hands aside. Her entire body went rigid, her jaw clenched. The atmosphere in the room shifted, thickened, as though the chandelier's light had dimmed. The fabric lifted just enough for him to see. Daniel Whitmore's eyes locked on the mark, and for a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. A long, jagged scar stretched across Clara Hayes's pale thigh, running from the top of her leg toward her hip. It wasn't the kind of wound life gave you by accident. This was deliberate, violence carved into flesh. The skin had healed, but the message beneath it was still fresh, still burning. Daniel felt something stir in his chest, part shock, part anger, at the thought that someone had once done this to her. His voice, when it finally came, was quieter than he expected. "Clara, who did this to you?" The words hung in the air like a delicate glass about to shatter. Clara's shoulders tightened. She turned her head just enough for him to see the profile of her face. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It doesn't matter." She said, her voice low, but edged with steel. "I'm here to work, not to talk about my past." But Daniel could hear what her tone tried to conceal. The exhaustion of carrying a burden too heavy for too long. The discipline it took not to let that weight crush her. Her chin lifted slightly, a quiet defiance in the midst of her vulnerability. He realized then that this wasn't just about modesty. It was about survival. Daniel's gaze shifted from the scar back to her eyes. He could see the tension in the way she gripped the marble counter, her knuckles pale, her breathing controlled and deliberate. "I'm not asking as your employer," he said finally, his voice steady but softer now. "I'm asking as a man who doesn't like seeing someone carry pain they shouldn't have to." Her eyes flickered toward him, hesitant, guarded, but also searching. For what he didn't know, perhaps a lie, perhaps a sign she could trust him. But after a heartbeat, she shook her head. "Some things are better left alone." Daniel didn't touch her again, but he also didn't look away. "Maybe to you," he murmured, "but it matters to me." The moment hung between them, thick with something neither could name. Then Clara smoothed her dress down, squared her shoulders, and stepped past him without another word, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Daniel stayed in the washroom long after she was gone, staring at the marble floor. But his mind wasn't on the stone beneath his feet. It was on that scar, and the truth he now knew he couldn't walk away from. The house had settled into its nighttime rhythm, dim hallways, the muffled tick of the grandfather clock, and the occasional creak from the old wood framing the upper floors. Daniel Whitmore found Clara Hayes in the staff laundry room, her back to him, as she folded crisp white sheets with meticulous precision. She didn't flinch when he spoke, though her hands froze mid-fold. "You don't have to be afraid of me," Daniel said, his voice softer than his usual businesslike tone. "Maybe not," Clara murmured, turning slightly to meet his gaze. "But I have every reason to be careful." For a moment he considered leaving it there, but something about the way she said it, measured certain, told him this was his chance to understand. He stepped further into the room, closing the distance between them to just a few feet. She leaned back against the long wooden table, her fingers twisting together in a nervous habit. Finally, her eyes dropped to the floor, and her voice, though quiet, carried the weight of years. "When I was 16, I worked for a family in the city she began. They treated me like I wasn't there, invisible, until they wanted something." Daniel stayed silent, letting her speak. Her breath hitched slightly before she went on. "The man of the house. He tried to hurt me." The words trembled but didn't break. "I fought back. I ran. But I was left with this scar." Daniel's jaw tightened, his fists curling at his sides. "And no one protected you." His voice was low, dangerous. "No one," she said simply. "They saw me as poor, unworthy, just because I wasn't from their world, just because my family didn't have money." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a tired acceptance that pierced him deeper than rage ever could. He studied her face in the dim light, noting the quiet courage it took to speak these words aloud. Her strength, he realized, wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to keep living despite it. "I can't change what happened to you," Daniel said, his voice steady, "but I can tell you this. No one will ever touch you like that again. Not while I'm here." Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to answer, but the words didn't come. Instead, her eyes searched his face, looking for a hint of insincerity. She found none. For a moment, the air between them shifted warmer now, the faintest thread of trust beginning to weave itself into the space where fear had lived for so long. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Whitmore dining room, pooling over the polished oak table. Usually the space felt cold and cavernous, meant more for appearances than for human connection. But today, something was different. When Clara Hayes entered balancing a tray of folded linen napkins, she stopped short. Daniel Whitmore was already seated, not at the head of the table where he always sat, but off to the side. In front of him were two cups, one steaming with coffee, the other filled with amber-colored tea. Her steps slowed. "Sir, Clara!" he said, interrupting gently but firmly. "Sit." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the tray. "I still have work." "This is important." Daniel cut in his tone, calm but unyielding. "I don't see you as just a maid. I see you as a woman who survived something no one should have to face, and you deserve to be treated like more than a servant." The words stunned her. They weren't flattery. They weren't a performance. They were raw, human, and disarming. For a long moment, she just stood there, unsure whether to trust what she was hearing. Finally, she set the tray down and crossed the room. The chair creaked softly as she lowered herself into it. Daniel slid the tea toward her. "You strike me as a tea person." Clara's fingers wrapped slowly around the warm cup. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. His gaze held hers, not in the way men sometimes look at women, but as though each word she spoke mattered. "Most people think strength is about power or control, but the kind you have, it's rarer. It's the kind that survives quietly, even when no one notices." Her throat tightened. She had heard praise before, but never like this. Not for her resilience, not for enduring. Daniel reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. It wasn't possession. It wasn't demand. It was a quiet promise, an unspoken vow that she was safe here. Clara didn't pull away. In fact, her fingers shifted slightly closer to his almost instinctively. And in that fragile, wordless moment, something in her heart, something that had been locked away for years, gave the smallest sign of opening. The days that followed were unlike any Clara Hayes had known since she first stepped into the Whitmore estate. The cold corridors didn't seem quite so intimidating anymore, and the echo of her footsteps no longer sounded like she was walking alone. It began with the smallest gestures. If she carried a heavy tray from the kitchen, Daniel Whitmore would appear seemingly out of nowhere and take half the weight without being asked. If she was in the garden pruning roses, he would wander over, hands in his pockets, pretending to admire the blooms, only to start asking about her favorite books or what her childhood had been like. There was a gentleness to it, a rhythm that unfolded slowly. One afternoon, as she was dusting the mass of bookshelves in the library, Daniel strolled in and set a cup of tea on the table beside her. "Thought you might need this," he said casually, before settling into an armchair with a book. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them felt easy, comfortable, like two people sharing the same warmth without having to name it. Some nights, she would find herself sitting across from him in that same library, a fire crackling in the hearth, their teacups cooling between them as conversation meandered into unexpected corners. Childhood dreams, favorite places, regrets they rarely voiced. Clara kept reminding herself it was nothing. He was simply being kind. A man like him wouldn't see someone like her as anything more than part of the staff. And yet, with each day, those moments carved deeper into her. Then came the night she left the staff wing later than usual. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the hall lights. She turned a corner and froze. At the far end of the grand staircase, Daniel stood beneath the chandelier's soft glow, one hand resting on the polished banister. "Clara," he called gently. She stepped closer, unsure what he wanted, but the look in his eyes wasn't the distant, guarded gaze she had first known. It was steady, warm, almost vulnerable. In that moment, she realized something had shifted, not just in the way he saw her, but in the way she was beginning to see him. The air in the grand hall was still the chandelier, casting a soft golden light over the polished marble. Clara Hayes hesitated at the bottom of the staircase, her heart thudding louder than the quiet tick of the clock somewhere in the distance. Daniel Whitmore descended each step slowly, his gaze fixed on her as though she were the only person in the world. "I know where I stand in life," he began, his voice low, but carrying easily in the silence. "I don't care about wealth or titles." His shoes clicked softly against the stone, each step closing the space between them. "I care about the woman who taught me that strength isn't in money. It's in surviving, in forgiving, and in loving despite the pain." Clara's breath caught, her throat tightened, and she shook her head slightly. "Daniel, I never thought a man from your world would want someone like me." He reached the final step, his expression softening into something almost reverent. "Someone like you." His voice dropped to a tender murmur. "Clara, there is no one like you." Her eyes glistened as he raised his hands, cupping her face with a gentleness that made her feel both fragile and unbreakable all at once. For a heartbeat, the world outside the Whitmore estate seemed to vanish. Then he kissed her. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't claiming. It was slow, certain, a kiss that spoke of promise rather than possession. Warmth bloomed in her chest, melting years of caution, loosening the iron grip fear had held over her heart. When they finally parted, the house seemed different. The halls that had once felt cold now carried a pulse of quiet warmth, a new kind of life. From that night on, the change was visible to more than just the two of them. Staff members caught glimpses. Daniel walking alongside Clara in the garden, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, his hand brushing hers when no one was looking. They shared laughter while arranging flowers in the drawing room, and sometimes vanished for hours only to reappear with the calm glow of two people who had found a safe place in each other. For Clara, it wasn't just about falling in love. It was about finding someone who saw her, not as a servant, not as a victim, but as a whole person worth standing beside. And for Daniel, it was about more than affection. It was about choosing to step past every wall he had built to keep people out, because this time, letting someone in was worth the risk. Autumn settled gently over the Whitmore estate, bringing a crisp edge to the mornings and a deep honeyed glow to the afternoons. Clara Hayes found herself looking forward to each day in a way she hadn't in years. There was a new steadiness in her steps, a quiet anticipation in her heart, one she tried not to name, but which was becoming harder to deny. One evening, the sky blushed with the last colors of sunset, spilling amber light across the marble floor. Clara was finishing up in the library, her hands lingering on the spines of the books she had just dusted, when she heard footsteps approach. She turned to see Daniel Whitmore standing in the doorway, watching her with that same unwavering gaze she had begun to recognize as his way of speaking without words. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The fire in the hearth crackled, sending flickers of gold across the room. "I've been thinking," Daniel began, his voice low, deliberate, "about what you've been through, about what you've taught me without even trying." Clara tilted her head, slightly unsure where this was going. "I've spent years believing strength was about control, about never letting anyone see your weakness. But you've shown me it's about surviving, about forgiving, about still being able to love after the world has tried to break you." He moved closer, his words carrying the weight of confession. Her throat tightened. "Daniel, He stopped just inches away, his voice soft but certain. "You've changed the way I see everything, Clara. And I need you to know. I don't care about where you came from. I care about you." Her breath hitched, a rush of emotions flooding her chest. "I never thought a man from your world would want someone like me," she whispered. Daniel's expression deepened, his voice almost reverent. "Someone like you, Clara? There is no one like you." He reached up, cupping her face with both hands. For a long, still moment, they simply looked at each other, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, his steady with a promise he had never made to anyone before. Then his lips found hers in a kiss that was slow, certain, and tender. Not a claiming, but a vow. In that instant, the years of fear that had weighed her down began to loosen piece by piece. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was choosing to live. The days that followed moved with a new rhythm, one that no one in the Whitmore estate could ignore. The sharp lines of formality that had once defined the household began to soften, replaced by something warmer, more human. It wasn't grand gestures or dramatic declarations that marked the change. It was the quiet things. Daniel Whitmore walking beside Clara Hayes in the garden, as though he had always belonged there, the two of them pausing to admire the way the late morning sun lit the petals of the roses. The subtle touch of his hand against hers when they passed in the hallway, as if to remind her he was there. The way their laughter, once rare, now seemed to echo through the rooms that had for so long been filled with silence. The staff noticed, though none spoke of it openly. In whispered exchanges over folded linens or in the kitchen, after hours they shared small observations. How Daniel's expression changed when Clara entered the room, how her posture seemed lighter, her eyes brighter. One rainy afternoon, Clara stood at the drawing room window, watching rivulets chase each other down the glass. Daniel joined her without a word, simply standing close enough that their shoulders brushed. Outside, the world blurred into gray, but inside the air between them felt certain, steady. It wasn't about erasing the past. They both knew scars, whether seen or unseen, didn't vanish. But here in this unlikely pairing of two people from such different worlds, there was proof that scars didn't have to define the future. Daniel hadn't chosen Clara because she was perfect, and she hadn't chosen him because he could protect her. They had chosen each other because against all odds they understood one another's silences. And as the rain tapped gently against the glass, Clara realized she was no longer just a maid moving quietly through someone else's home. She was a woman who had been seen, truly seen, and chosen not in spite of her past, but because of the strength it had given her. Love stories often arrive in unexpected shapes, sometimes not with a whirlwind of passion, but with the quiet, steady unfolding of trust. Clara Hayes' journey inside the Whitmore estate began as one of survival. Every step she took, every glance she avoided, was calculated to protect herself from a world that had already tried to hurt her. And Daniel Whitmore, a man known for keeping others at arm's length, never expected that the person who would reach past his defenses would be the quiet young woman polishing silver in his dining room. Their story wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about rescuing or being rescued. It was about recognition. The moment one soul sees another scarred, but still standing, and chooses to stay. In Clara, Daniel saw resilience, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but lives quietly in every choice to keep going. And in Daniel, Clara found someone who didn't flinch at her pain or try to erase it, but instead offered a space where it no longer had to be hidden. As the days turned into weeks, the two of them built something unshakable in the small spaces between grand moments. Tea shared at the breakfast table, conversations that drifted long past midnight, the unspoken promise in a hand resting lightly against another's. The Whitmore estate would remain grand, its halls lined with portraits and polished stone. But for Clara, it was no longer just a place of employment. It had become a home, a place where she could walk without fear, laugh without looking over her shoulder, and love without wondering when it might be taken away. And for Daniel, it was no longer just an estate. It was where he learned that real strength isn't in the walls you build, but in the ones you're willing to let fall.